Aljazzera, Highsdale Rahman, also coming up in the next 30 minutes. Bidding farewell to a revered monarch, Bangkok grinds to a halt for King Bhumibhol's 5-day funeral. Brazil's president survives a key parliamentary vote to put him on trial for corruption. And classified documents into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy are set to be released more than 50 years after his killing. Welcome to the programme. Polls for the controversial presidential rerun in Kenya are now open. Opposition leader Raila Odinga has withdrawn from the election and has asked supporters to boycott the vote. It comes as protesters have been throwing stones at police in Nairobi's Kibera district. The Supreme Court had annulled the elections held in August due to irregularities. Well, how did we get there? On August the 11th, Uhuru Kenyatta was declared the winner of the initial presidential election held 3 days earlier, but his rival, Raila Odinga, was quick to cry foul, saying that the result was hacked and manipulated. He took these allegations to the Supreme Court, and on the 1st of September, the judges declared the elections invalid and ordered a rerun within 60 days. More than a month later, Odinga suddenly withdrew his candidacy from the rerun, saying he still didn't believe the Election Commission could ensure a fair race. Well, let's cross over to our reporters in Kenya. Famida Miller is in the capital, Nairobi. Catherine Soy is in the opposition stronghold of Kisumu. Let's go to Famida first. You're actually within a polling station. Just tell us what's been going on, considering the tension has been rising in the capital.
Sohail, there was a fairly steady stream of voters coming into this polling station in the center of Nairobi, but just 2 hours into the polling day, it's now slowed to a trickle. It has been raining, so that of course would impact the number of people coming out, but essentially it's this boycott that the opposition has called, as well as security concerns. Now, we did speak to the President Thabo Mbeki, who's leading the African Union Observer Mission in Kenya. He said about half an hour ago that it's too early really to judge how the election has gone. We had asked him if there was concern around this boycott and how it would impact credibility. He wouldn't really answer on that issue, but of course this is an issue for many observer missions, some of them even withdrawing. Now, at this polling station, we do know that in August, with the initial presidential election, there were lines around the block leading into the main streets in Nairobi. This time round, it looks as if a number of voters are staying away.
Indeed, and Famida, we can show our viewers now live pictures of disturbances happening across Nairobi in the Kibera camp. Just for our viewers, explain to us why Kibera would be a centre point or a flash point for disturbances.
Sohail, Kibera is a stronghold of the opposition, the National Super Alliance, but specifically the Orange Democratic Party that forms part of that alliance. We were in Kibera earlier in the week speaking to people there, and many had told us that they would prevent the election from taking place. They would prevent people from voting in areas of Kibera. We do know that there are some areas today there that are very tense. At least 2 polling stations haven't opened at all. 5 others have. There is some voting taking place, but ultimately the concern there is security and people being prevented from going to the polling stations. One area of concern, of course, and what we've seen in Kenya for a number of years, is an issue of tribalism and people forming alliances along these lines. Now, given that Kibera is made up primarily by Luo people, they would then want to support the opposition alliance, and this is partly why we're seeing some of the polls or some elections taking place in some of the areas in Kibera.
Well, for the moment, we'll leave it there with you, Famida, and cross over to your colleague and ours, Catherine Soy, who's in the stronghold of Kisumu. Sporadic, small flashpoints in the capital there, Catherine. The scene is very different where you are, though it is still an opposition stronghold.
Absolutely. And let me just start by saying we've also had some incidents in some areas here in Kisumu. Protesters in some parts, we've been told, are already out on the streets saying that they're not going to come out and vote. And just coming back to where I am, let me just paint a picture for you, Sohail. In August, during the last election, these grounds were full of people, queues and voters. But today we've seen nobody. Polling materials have just arrived here, but we've spoken to the returning officer. That's the chief electoral commission official here in Kisumu Central, it's called, and he said he's not been able to distribute voting materials to any of the 199 polling stations in his area of operation. He says another challenge he's facing is that his staff members are not coming to work. They're supposed to be about 399 electoral official clerks and presiding officers and things like that who are supposed to be working, but he has only seen 4 reporting to work. So he says that's a problem, and it has been a struggle really, Sohail, for us to just get a polling station that is open. We've been to about 4 polling stations. They've been closed. When we arrived at this polling station, there was a bit of panic because those who were transporting the materials had gone missing. They weren't answering their calls, but finally the materials came here. But like I said, no one is voting. Many of the roads have been blocked as well.
Well, for the moment, we'll leave it there. Of course, it is a very long day in that election process. We'll continue coverage live from Kenya throughout our bulletins. For the moment, Catherine and Famida, thank you. And the other main global story that we're following here on Aljazzera is the cremation ceremony of the late King Bhumibol Adulyadej from Thailand. Now, the cremation is the main part of the 5-day funeral service. It's led by the late King's son, Rama X. The much-loved Thai monarch died just over a year ago after reigning for 7 days. Wayne Hay has more from Bangkok.
The funeral ceremony lasts for 5 days, but of course the main day is Thursday when the late King Bhumibol Adulyadej will be cremated. There are actually 2 cremation ceremonies, one a symbolic ceremony and then the main cremation, which will take place late on Thursday evening in a purpose-built funeral site, a purpose-built crematorium on a site just outside the Grand Palace. Before then, it's a very slow procession taking the royal urn containing the body of the late King from the Grand Palace, where he has been lying for the past year, eventually making its way just outside the gates to that funeral site. But it's a very slow procession. Will take around 3 hours before they arrive at that funeral site. As you can imagine, it's a very hot day in Bangkok, but that hasn't stopped thousands of people coming out onto the streets. The palace was expecting some 250,000 people to fill the streets around the funeral site to say a final goodbye to the late King Bhumibol Adulyadej.
South America now, where Brazil's lower house of Congress has voted to reject corruption charges against President Michel Temer. He was in hospital when the vote was taken. He's accused of taking bribes, which he denies. The lower house has voted in his favour and decided that he will not face trial at the Supreme Court on charges of criminal conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Daniel Schweimler has the latest from Buenos Aires.
President Michel Temer has done it again. He survived a vote in the lower house of Congress which wanted to suspend him for up to 180 days so the Supreme Court could try him on corruption charges. He did the same back in August by a similar vote. Although he's one of the most unpopular presidents that Brazil has ever seen, with popularity ratings of around 4%, he managed to win enough support in that Congress so that the opposition could not get the two-thirds of votes necessary. One congressperson at a time came to the microphone. They were given 15 seconds to speak before the microphone was cut off to say yes or no as to whether they supported Michel Temer or not. He is accused of taking bribes by the JBS, a massive meat packing firm. Some of that conversation was recorded. He all along has denied the charges. He is part of a much larger criminal investigation known as Lava Jato, or the car wash scandal, scandal, which has implicated hundreds of politicians and business people across Brazil, some of them serving time in prison, some of them waiting to be tried, some of them plea bargaining, saying they're going to name names. But Michel Temer has escaped. He will serve out the last 14 months of his time in office. He says to push through vital measures to boost Brazil's ailing economy, to get it back on track. But he has survived, but he is a much weakened president.
The US ambassador to the United Nations has been evacuated from a UN camp for displaced people in South Sudan after security guards fired tear gas at protesters demonstrating against President Salva Kiir. Nikki Haley had earlier met the president to discuss ways to end the 4-year civil war that has displaced millions of people. Hiba Morgan reports now from Juba.
The United States backed South Sudan when it became independent after a referendum in 2011. But for more than 3 years now, South Sudan has been locked in a civil war. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, hopes to convince President Salva Kiir to make peace.
I didn't come here to talk. I came here to basically say the time for action is now. We're not waiting anymore. We need to see a change, and we need to see it right away. And there's nothing that they can say at this point. We have lost trust in the government, and we now need to regain that trust. And the only way to regain that trust is through the actions of taking care of all of the people. President Kiir is the president of everyone, not just one tribe, not just one group.
Fighting broke out in South Sudan in 2013 when President Kiir accused his former vice president, Riek Machar, of a coup. A peace agreement supported by the U.S. was signed in 2015, but there was more violence less than a year later, forcing Machar to flee the country. In September this year, the U.S. sanctioned 2 government officials and the former military chief of staff for derailing the peace process. But South Sudan's government now says it's ready to work for a deal.
The president also assured Her Excellency the Ambassador that the government would also be observing a cessation of hostilities in order basically to create a conducive atmosphere for the dialogue, and also to show the government's commitment that all political disputes and conflicts in the Republic of South Sudan, as far as the government is concerned, can only be resolved through dialogue.
The humanitarian situation has only gotten worse as the war dragged on. More than half of the population here rely on aid to survive, and the United States is the largest donor, providing more than $700 million per year. The ambassador seemed concerned at how that aid gets to those in need and how aid workers are protected. 82 have been killed in the conflict so far. A quarter of the 12 million population has been displaced. There have been reports of atrocities committed by all warring parties, from sexual abuses to killings based on ethnicities. Many children have no access to proper education. Analysts say those committed to peace must work harder.
The parties to the peace agreement who are still strongly convinced that the peace agreement exists need to do more to ensure that South Sudanese restore some trust in their state, and that our people don't have to flee across the borders.
A few hours in South Sudan may not solve the country's problems or end the war, but UN Ambassador Haley hopes it's at least a start. Hiba Morgan, Aljazzera, Juba.
Still ahead here on Aljazzera, mass protests in Catalonia as Spain's government prepares to impose direct rule. Also, looking for a solution in Yemen, why it's being called a dire humanitarian situation. All that coming up after the break.